In Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right, so we are going through our Doctrine series, and today we're continuing into science and creation type of idea and thoughts. And now next week, well, not next week, next week's Mother's Day, we will stop and do something special for Mother's Day. 2 weeks after this, I have to tell you something, we're going to do the same thing, Science and Creation, Part 2. And then after that, we will talk about the different types of different ideas about creation that Christian groups adhere to or look at or consider, okay? Now, before we do anything else, as we talk about science and creation, one of the important things to remember is that no matter what view we have, we always come back to the view that God is the one who established the creation. Not only did he establish the creation, but he maintains the creation. He's the one that keeps everything together so that it works, so that we can have life. So he set it up for us to have life, and he maintains it so that we can continue in life. So those are some of the key things. Now, as you see on the screen there, it says 10th grade geometry class, okay? Yes, I can still remember 10th grade geometry class. And I was trying to remember the teacher's name. I couldn't remember the teacher's name. But one of the things back was, back in my day, we had chalkboards. You guys remember chalkboards? And a lot of you remember chalkboards. And my geometry teacher, he would, he was a special guy. He had different colors of chalk. He had red chalk and blue chalk and yellow chalk and white chalk, standard. And I think he had something like purple or something else like that. And so when he was writing on his geometry board, and we're writing on the board and we were taking notes in class, he'd write things. Well, he wouldn't use an eraser to erase. He would take his hand and do like this. And the funny thing about it is that sometimes he'd turn around and face the back of the class and you see a big handprint back here in chalk. And we used to laugh about that. And he was, he's kind of quirky in that way, but he was actually a great guy, and he was a very, very good teacher. And plus that, when we went skiing on the weekends, snow skiing on the weekends, he was a ski patrol guy, and so we would see him there too. So he was a fun guy, but he taught us a lot about geometry. And one of the things I remember about geometry, and probably not the only thing I remember, but the thing that stood out the most for me is when he started the basics of geometry, teaching us about what axioms are. Axioms, those are the common things we can all agree on, okay? They're just accepted as being true, okay? We could say in geometry, you can say, from one point to another point, you draw something, that's a line, that's an axiom. We can consider that, okay? And then you have postulates. Postulates, a little bit different than axioms. You can't really prove them. Not everybody agrees on them, but they're pretty much commonly accepted. Then you have theorems. And this is the part of geometry I hated, because if you remember back in geometry when you were in high school, or some of you in junior high, I know you took geometry early, but you had theorems. And what was geometry class at that time? You had to prove theorems. You had to do proofs, okay? Because proofs are showing that a theorem can be true, okay? Now, the thing about theorems is there's not absolute proof for the theorem. Make sense? Okay? I theorize this. All my experiments, everything show that it could be true, but maybe it's not. Maybe there's something I haven't thought about. Now, I give you those things because, to me, those things are important because they set up my thinking a few years later. Okay? Because when we talk about geometry, it says these elements work together to form a deductive system. Okay? A process, a thought process. Axioms provide the foundation. Theorems build upon that foundation, and proofs validate that theorems are true consequences of the axioms. Important to my thinking. So a few years later, I'm in university. Okay? And in university, my background is I had an engineering major, so there's a lot of science background there, okay? A lot of basic science, not science like a bunch of you guys are involved in. I wouldn't understand any of that. So today, if I say things that are wrong, in a couple of weeks, you can tell me after church, you're wrong on that. But there were some basic things I understood. And when we talk about scientific axioms, there are some things. Causality. This is very important. Every effect has a cause. Okay? Events in nature don't occur informally, but randomly, but follow cause and effect type of relationships. Okay? You come up to me, you hit me in the face, I say, ow. That's a cause and effect relationship. Okay? It continues on after that, but we won't go into that. Okay? But it is a cause and effect relationship. Other thing, uniformity in nature. Look at this. Is that laws of physics are consistent across time and space. They don't change once you get out of the Earth's atmosphere. They don't change in Mars. They don't change in Neptune. They don't change, in some far-off universe that you saw in Star Trek. Okay? They're all consistently the same everywhere. And it says this is important because it enables us to make predictions about distant stars or historical events. And then the next thing, okay, is called harnessing. Help me. There you go. Okay. When multiple explanations are possible, the simplest one requiring the fewest assumptions is preferable. Okay. I'm always doing things, and Nancy's always asking me why. Okay. Well, I could give her like 4 or 5 different reasons, and I usually choose the simple. I don't know. I'm just stupid. Okay. I don't say I'm stupid. I usually say I don't know because I don't want to say I'm stupid. Okay. Well, I don't know. That's the simplest explanation. Now, there are sometimes that is the only explanation. I don't know why I did that. Okay. But the fact of it is, it says that when possible, you choose the simplest explanation. And then you have testability. Can you test it? Scientific claims must be potentially falsifiable or falsifiable through observation or experiment. Important to consider, important to remember that as we go through and we talk about science and creation, okay? And then the last one, objectivity. Very important. And the more I read about science in the last 20 to 30 years, the more I see that this one is going down. And what I mean by that is scientists never have been completely objective because they form a theorem, they want to prove their theorem right. But objectivity means that natural phenomena exist independently of our perception and be studied without bias. It is hard in anything in life not to have bias. Let's just admit that, okay? But when we look at science and when we look at things in these next couple of sessions, one of the things that we need to be aware of is there's a lot of bias out there. And remember last week when we talked about Romans chapter 1, and we talked about the importance part of it, we said there's 2 or 3 different things. And the first thing I said, and probably the most important thing, is that when we start approaching science, we can have a different world view on it. We can have a Christian worldview, and we look at science through those eyes. And it happens, all right? So, we had those axioms. We fast forward then to when I was in university. I'm sitting in biology classes. Biology class had a couple different biology classes, but this particular one had about 100, 150 students in it. I usually, in the lecture hall, I kind of like to sit about halfway down, right on the aisle on the right side, and I like to sit there because, again, back then, the professors wrote things on the chalkboard, or actually we had a whiteboard by then. We were, advanced school with whiteboard, and he wrote things on whiteboard. And I had other biology professor like to use, remember overhead projectors? Where you write things and it would project. But this guy liked to write on. And so I sat there because that was the best angle because you were looking down and you can kind of see above him, so what you could see while he was writing, so when you're taking notes. Now, this guy was a good professor, no doubt about it, but he was pretty boring because I remember one thing about my notes is that when I go to study for the test or I go look at my notes of things, I write, and then there'd just kind of be a line. And that's where I fell asleep, okay? Then I'd wake up and I'd write some more, and, okay? But one of the things about that professor is he was always saying, how could you possibly believe in God or Creator? He was an atheist, and he made it known very, 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 very plain. Well, one day, we're talking about, I don't remember exactly what we're talking about, RNA, DNA, enzymes, proteins, amino acids, whatever. We were talking about, and he kept breaking things down and breaking things down, smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. This has to go exactly with this, and these have to be paired with these, and these have to be paired with these, and these have to be paired with these. And you get bigger and bigger and bigger. And I sat there and I thought, how? How can you not believe there's some kind of design in this? That was my thoughts, okay? With every turn and every lecture, I began to see how complicated living organisms are. And it started me to ask, how can I accept all this happened by random chance? It was my thought. That's what I learned in that biology class. How can I accept that all this happened by random chance? So I made a choice at that time. And my choice was I going to believe in the God of creation who created it all, who all things were created through, who maintains it all? Or am I going to go the road that science at that time was seemingly telling me I had to follow? The road that you had to believe in Darwinism, the road that you had to believe in evolution, the road that, we didn't have the Big Bang Theory back then, but the road that you had to believe that it all just happened by chance. And I chose to take the road of God, of a powerful, all-knowing being who's always existed, who had the power to speak, and it was created. Now, I didn't know how that was going to play out, because I felt like I was putting myself at odds with things that I was learning. So I started looking for things and started considering things, okay? It felt like that I had to pick that side. It felt like that I was, okay, God, I'm making this choice. Help me to see if this choice is right or not, okay? And then this is where I ran into that verse that we shared last week, Romans 1:20, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power. Now think about that, eternal power, always there, ability to create out of nothing. His divine nature. He has the smarts, if you want to use that word. He has the intelligence. He has the will. He has everything he needs to create. Has been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. And I can remember when reading that verse, and I'm thinking, God, wow, okay. And I looked up some other verses just here, actually during the worship team, but during the worship I looked up some other verses because I was reminded that shortly after that I was out hiking and camping and up in the mountains, and one morning I was reading Psalms 104. And Psalms 104 talks about that God is clothed in his grandeur. And you look out onto the fields and everything else, and you see God. And in that chapter, later in the chapter, in fact, maybe I'll read a little bit of the chapter in a couple of weeks from now, but in the middle of the chapter, he talks about how God provides the water that nourishes the grass, and the grass feeds the cows. And it happened to be that right where I was sitting out on a precipice, sitting on some rocks on kind of the top of a mountain. I looked out, and across the valley I could see cows down in the field feeding. And I just went, whoa, awesome. You can see God in the creation. But was that enough? So kept on looking, kept on searching, and then I ran across what was called chaos theory. Okay, what was called, it still is called chaos theory. Okay, and chaos theory is simply I got a definition of chaos theory. I thought I'd get a real definition instead of telling you. Here's what it is. It's a fascinating branch of mathematics that studies the behavior of dynamic systems and highly sensitive to initial conditions. My definition is this: everything can be mapped by a mathematical equation. That's what we've discovered. We've discovered that there's mathematical equations to how smoke rolls up from a fire. There are mathematical equations to determine lots of different things. One of the most famous kind of ideas of chaos theory is that if here, maybe down in Australia, a butterfly flutters its wings, and that causes us to experience a typhoon a couple of weeks from now. That's how it works. I said there's an equation that can map all that. Chaos theory and the equations that they've been able to find have been available, throughout history, but we've been able to find them, we've been able to map them out and see them because of modern development with computers and technology and things like that. And so it helps. It helps me when I started discovering chaos theory, okay? And when I discovered chaos theory, I also ran across another article. It's called The Geophysics of God. Now, at the end of worship, I'll put up the QR code that you can scan, and it opens a Google Drive folder, and in there you'll find a PDF of the Geophysics of God that originally appeared in Time magazine in 1995, 1997, somewhere in there, okay? And what the Geophysics of God is that there's a scientist in Los Alamos National Labs in the U.S., which is was at that time, still think it is one of the leading research institutions in the U.S. Los Alamos was a place that had the highest percentage of people with doctoral degrees than any other place in the world. That's this type of research, okay? Some of you know the atomic bomb was created there, some other things. And this scientist, a geophysicist, he was also a Christian, and he knew chaos theory, he knew a bunch of other things, and so he put together a program. And he says when he put together the program with the purpose of proving Noah's flood. So he wrote a program. It's a program that is in use a lot. It's been very valuable to other geophysicists, it's even gotten into art and some other things. But basically, if you look at terraforming, it's got some of the same ideas into it. And what he was able to do with his program was he put a certain set of parameters in it, and in those parameters, what it shows how Noah's flood happened. Okay? There were some cytoplast things that popped up from the ocean floor, so they pushed the water up at the same time as the rain came down and all this. But it shows that Noah's flood could happen as it was described in the Bible. I thought, oh, that's pretty interesting. Now, he does say this, and he notes this, that you can put a different set of parameters in, and it shows the world developed as science normally teaches the world developed over millions and millions of years. So, it's there. Is it an absolute proof? No. But it starts pointing the way to something else must be there. Something else that we know as being God, being there involved in the creation. Okay? I won't get into the plate tectonics and stuff like that. Chaos theory. To me, this is one of the most fascinating things about chaos theory. Okay? It was a Barnsley Fern. And it says graphically beautiful structures can be built from repetitive use of mathematical formulas with computers. So here's what they did. They found a formula. They put an initial set of data into the formula. Okay? They took that data and they plotted a point on a graphic printer. They took that points data and they put it back into the equation and repeated it over and over and over and over. Okay? Now, you can do this by hand. The formula is not that complex, but to do it by hand, it would take you a lifetime to plot all these points. Okay? But with computers, with graphics, how we have it now, as you repeat it millions and millions of times, you eventually get that fern leaf that you see down there on the bottom right. Points to design, a mathematical equation. So, I like the book. The book, they've updated the book, and so you can buy the updated book, like on Amazon and other places. You can get it, paperback, hardback, ebook format, or actually the old version of the book's available for free by PDF. So again, I've uploaded that for you. You can go look at it if you want to. Okay. What about thermodynamics? Engineering background, I had to take classes with thermodynamics. We had to learn about it. We sat in classes with thermodynamics, and we talked about the first law, second law, third law of thermodynamics. And as we looked at them, there's actually a fourth law. It's called, the 0 law. I don't remember what it says exactly right now, but If you look at the second law of thermodynamics, it's the entropy increases in an isolated system. Well, what does that really mean? Well, here's what it really means, okay? So if you look at it, it describes how systems naturally tend to a state of greater disorder or randomness known as entropy. You go outside, you walk around, you see a tree, you cut that tree down, you leave it there. You come back 10 years from now, and miraculously nobody's disturbed the tree. But what do you see? Well, you may not see anything left of the tree, or you may see just a kind of a pile of debris there. It breaks down time and time and time again, okay? Things break down with time. It states that the total entropy of an isolated system or the universe as a whole always increases or remains constant over time. This means that over time, things tend to move toward a more random and disordered state. Now, you think about that. And I sit there and I remember studying this and looking at this. Remember, I've developed this Christian worldview of things. I'm looking for God in the creation. And I started thinking, but everything we learned in biology, everything we've learned in everything else always says that things miraculously got more organized and better and better. And it wasn't just that happened one time. It was like you had to have a million things happen for this one thing to happen. So you had 1,000,001 things that had to happen that got more organized. And I thought, how can that be? So we have all these things. And you had me thinking, science is telling me one thing, the Bible is telling me something else. I'm choosing the Bible. I'm starting to see how God is involved. Now, I have to admit, from the early 2000s to now, I haven't paid much attention to it. Because I'm kind of one of those people, when I get something settled in my mind, it's like that settled in my mind, I don't need to follow this anymore. So a few weeks ago, when we hit this creation in our doctrine, and when I started reading different things, I kind of got excited. I was like, woohoo! And I got so excited that I actually bought 4 different books and started reading those. And because I bought one book, and there's a book called The Case for the Creation by Lee Strobel. And if you want just one book to read, it's a good summary of everything else. In fact, some of the other books I bought were because of that book. And we're going to see a lot of quotes from that book today. But when I started getting into it, I was just like, this is so exciting because there's so many things I didn't know about. There's so many scientists out there in the world that actually, these are smart people, and, they kind of agree with dumb old me, or dumb old me agrees with them, probably the way it is, okay? And I just got so excited. I was reading all these books, and I told Nancy Friday, and Nancy, we were talking, and I was like, well, the sermon prep's really hard, and she was like that, and I said, because just the one book, and I printed out the notes from that one book, and it was like, 17 pages or something like that of notes. I first put together the sermon, and I had 61 slides. That's an hour and a half sermon. So I hope you're not hungry. Okay? No. I did go back and take some out, and we're splitting it in 2. But here's the thing. It's exciting to me because what I'm reading is saying more and more scientists are admitting that there's some kind of design involved. Now, they don't admit that there's God always, but they admit. And we're going to talk about that next time. We're going to talk about what's called intelligent design. Okay? And like I said, not everybody agrees it's God, but a lot of people agree it's God. In the books that I've been reading, there's story after story, and some of the blogs that I've read, there's story after story of scientists. And then we're not talking about scientists that have 1 PhD. We're talking about scientists that maybe have 3 or 4 PhDs in different fields, astrophysics, physics, biochemistry, biology, all these things. And after diving deep into these things, a lot of them have become Christians because they have been faced with, we can't go any deeper with the science. Something else made it happen. Now, the opposite thing has happened too. And we'll read about this, and we'll read one of the quotes that says this, that science world right now, you have those that are being objective in what they find, and their objectivity is saying to them there has to be something else there, and so they start looking toward God. Then you have those who are not objective, and they say, well, no, we can't ever accept God, so they start developing theories and ideas about how things could happen without God in it. And we're not going to dive deep into that, but when we look at different things, one of the things that comes out is those theories and ideas are not based on axioms. They're not based on those foundational principles that we all agree on. Some of them violate the laws of physics. Some of them violate our mind, okay? And when we start thinking about it, but it is there. Science and faith are not at war, is what Stephen Meyer has said. Now, Stephen Meyer he's a PhD. He's got several different degrees. He went to Berkeley, got his PhDs. He was at some other top colleges and things like that. He now is in Seattle, Discovery Institute in Seattle. Now, I will tell you, there is a lot of scientists that have published articles against him, okay, because they're mad at him because of the things that he says. But look what he says. Science and faith are not at war. When scientific evidence and biblical teaching are correctly interpreted, they can and do support each other. But that's not what the world tells us. I'd say to anyone who doubts that, investigate the evidence yourself. That's his story of why he became a Christian. Because he investigated the evidence himself, and it helped him to see God is there. Because God is revealed through the creation. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godliness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain. Kind of cool how Scripture fits a lot of what we're talking about. Case for Christ says this, or Case for Creator says this, says, in the big fundamental questions like belief in God or in disbelief is not settled by a single argument. Said this physicist turned theologian John, Polkinghorne. It's too complicated for that. What one has to do is consider lots of different issues and see whether or not the answers to one gets add to another total picture that makes sense. My goal in this is to challenge you in your accepting of science the way it's taught. And for you to do exactly what he says, to consider the different issues, to consider the different ideas. And I'm bringing these ideas and I'm bringing these issues to plant a seed of question in your mind. Not a question is in doubt, but a question is saying, how can I see God involved in it? Okay? All right. So, when we talk about science and creation, one of the first thing always pops up is evolution or Darwinism, okay? So we talk about Darwinism. It is basically a kind of a battle. You know, we said the war, there's not a war between science and creation, but or science and faith, but there's a battle. The battle is natural selection versus divine intervention. Did God create, or were we just happenstance, a random set of circumstances that all of a sudden put together to make this happen? Okay? That's what Darwinism is. It's a theory that all living creatures are modified descendants of a common ancestor that lived long, long, long ago. Okay? We have a great, relative that was just a little single cell organism. We all come from the same thing. Okay? And you know how it goes. You've seen some of the icons of science. You know, you've seen the picture of the early ape, and it grows and grows and grows, and eventually becomes a human. Okay, those things are what we're taught. We're taught about the tree of life, and we'll show you a picture of the tree of life later about how Everything separates and evolves and grows. And there are some concerns about this, okay? When we talk about Darwinism, it's a theory that all living creatures modified. Well, I wrote that before, okay? Oh, here we go. Darwin claims that every new species has ever been appeared can be explained by descent with modification. And then it claims that modifications are a result of natural selection acting on random genetic mutations. Now, when I got into this some more in some of the other books, it was just amazing about how some of the thoughts and ideas, but I got to move on. All right. Here are some early proofs, and I can remember seeing this in books when I was in school, especially in junior high and high school, okay, the mural experiment. And basically what happened was they took what they thought at the time was the Earth's atmosphere billions and billions of years ago. They put it into, a system. They ran electricity through that, and they were able to produce some amino acids. And they said, oh boy, looky here, we've got amino acids. We got the building blocks of life, so it is possible. But there are a few problems with that, okay? In 1995, Science Magazine said that experts now dismiss Miller's experiment because the early atmosphere looked nothing like the Miller-Urey simulation. So basically what they've discovered is that back when he did it in the 1950s, they thought the atmosphere was a certain way, but now they know that atmosphere was much different. And if you take the same experiment and you put the chemicals and things that were in the atmosphere of the Earth at that time, and you run this experiment, you actually produce things like formaldehyde, which is probably the worst thing about promoting life. Okay? So the experiment has actually kind of been turned on its head. But as you read about this and as you look at this, there are scientists that are still trying to prove this experiment is truth, that this experiment works. They have changed what's inside the test tube that they run the electricity through, but they're still trying to show it's valid. Now that comes back to when we look about those axioms about science, and we look at the things. When there are theorems and there are evidences against that theorem, then you start thinking that theorem may not be true. But for some reason in the last 20 years, the last 25 years especially, because that's when a lot of this has come out, that as more comes out against Darwinism, the more entrenched those who support it become. And the more things they come up with saying, well, it's because of this, it's because of that. So we look at that experiment, and it doesn't work. I like what Jonathan Wells says. Jonathan Wells is actually another multiple PhD type of guy, and he says this. It prominently featured in current textbooks, okay? And he was talking, he wrote a book called The Icons of Science. And he talks about this experiment, about the graph we see of the, extending from ape all the way to human, all that kind of thing. He says, the most generous thing I can say about it is misleading. It's wrong to even give the impression that science has empirically shown how life could have originated. So he said, especially in Western type of schools, we're still teaching this idea. But he said, when you get into the details and you read some of his other books, there is so much there about even if we could produce amino acids. So you just can't put a bunch of amino acids in the test tube and expect life to show up, a million years later. It just doesn't happen. You need other things. You need the DNA. You need all those other things to be part of it. So there are so many things there, okay, that are there. Look what Romans 1:21 says. For although they knew God, they never glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. Their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Do you see why I think this applies so much to this? Their foolish hearts were darkened. They refused to look at it through a God lens and to give God glory for what was going on. So we have some early proofs. The Miller experiments. Well, Darwin's tree of life. Here we go. Okay, it didn't show it very big there, but you see the tree of life over there. Okay, that was one of his first drawings in his book, Origin of the Species. Okay, it's an illustration of the fossil record. The tree of life is a dismal failure. Why is it a failure? It's a good representation of Darwin's theory, but it is a failure. It's a failure because of what the fossil record shows. Now, Darwin, some of the things I read said Darwin knew at that time that the fossil record didn't support his tree of life very well, but he thought that further discoveries would support it. Okay? But it isn't. He says, oh, well, actually, I put that in here. He believed that future discoveries would vindicate his theory, but it hasn't happened. And actually, what's happened over the last 50 years is that, or 150 years, is turned his tree upside down. And one of those things being the Cambrian explosion, which was something that Darwin knew about. Okay? And when we talk about the Cambrian, I don't know why I want to add extra syllables in there. The Cambrian explosion is basically, I like what they said in a couple of different books. It's evolution's Big Bang. Okay, and Yale Scientific says this: it's a near simultaneous appearance of most modern animal groups will appear between 540 and 520 million years ago, during what is termed the Cambrian explosion. Now, if you look at it, here's kind of a model of it, okay? And basically, the fossil record shows some single-cell organisms, so some early development, but there wasn't much change. There was little changes, but there wasn't much change. Then all of a sudden, in a short period of time, you had an explosion of all kinds of species. And one of the books I read said it's like this. It's like you have an open field, and that field is just full of dirt, and you didn't plant any seeds, you didn't do anything. The next day you get up, you go out there and you look and there's flowers, there's trees, there's other kind of plants, there's grass all over the place. All of a sudden they just all popped up out of nowhere. And the problem with this is that if you apply Darwin's theorem to this, there is no way that selection could have happened. There's no way, you don't have time for those things to take place. Okay? Now, again, scientists are still trying to prove this is true, and they've come up with some different theories and things and different ideas. But the point of it is, if God created, and God said, let there be animals, let there be plants, I don't think God would have said, I want a pine tree, I want a maple tree, I want an oak tree, I want birds, I want, reptiles, I want elephants, I gotta have dogs, because dogs are man's best friend. And I want mosquitoes. Why, God? He said, let it be. And it happened because he is beyond our imagination, beyond our understanding in his power. His eternal power is made known. The Big Bang of evolution has been problematic for many scientists. Among Charles Darwin found it difficult to explain how the spread of this period seemingly impossible rates of evolution fit within a framework of gradual evolutionary process. Okay? Now, like I said, I'm going overboard with this because I just got so excited about it myself. Okay? Many others, including opponents of evolution, have echoed the sentiments, declaring that a much longer period of time would have been required to allow such dramatic evolution. This is from Yale Scientific Magazine. So, there's questions there. There are thoughts there that doesn't quite work. Again, Jonathan Wells says this: it's absolutely contrary to Darwin's tree of life. These animals, which are fundamentally different in their body plans, appear fully developed all of a sudden in what paleontologists have called the single most spectacular phenomenon of the fossil record. They don't call it a miracle because they can't call it a miracle. Okay? It's a phenomenon. It's there. It happened. Verse 22 and 23 again. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images that may look like mortal human beings and birds and animals and reptiles. And I remember a few weeks ago reading through some of this, and I'm thinking, And birds and animals and reptiles, we are worshiping evolution. We are worshiping what has been created, not the creator. Okay? So our early proofs, and there's some other things, Hackett's embryos, and we're not going to talk about it just because of time. But there was problems with that. There was a bird that supposedly was a missing link, and they come to find that that bird wasn't true. There's been some other, quote, fossil discoveries in the last 20, 25 years, and one of them that was considered very significant, later they found out what was actually made in a factory somewhere in Asia. Not saying anything about Asia, but it was made in a factory in Asia, and it actually had modern-day turkey bones in it. Okay? And so there's a lot of people trying to produce things out there that are false proof. They're deceiving. They exchange things because they can't accept the idea of a God who created that type of thing. So, one last thing to talk about when we talk about Darwin, about the human-ape connection. Okay? And a few years ago, I was in South Africa, and I actually was at the Strunconian Caves, and the Strunconian Caves is where Lucy was found, and supposedly provided some connection and some filled in some missing pieces. And one of the things they had there, they had a display, and that display was probably as long as this room, and it was a display of, I don't think it was actual bone fragments, but it was replica of the bone fragments they found, and how each of these bone fragments showed a different part of the evolution of the tree and things like that. And as I walked in there and I looked at that display, some of the bone fragments were just like this. And they would have this whole drawn, ape like this, And it was like, how? And one of the interesting things about that was that in the reading that I did, one of the things I discovered was I think it was in Icons in Science, he talked about that they took one of those bone fragments, and they didn't tell anybody what it was, but they said, hey, we found this bone fragment, and what. And these were scientists, artists, kind of together, and they took it and they gave it to these different groups and said, give us a description of what you think this was and what it looked like, okay? And they did tell them, said, this is a humanoid. And they did it to like 6 different groups, and they came up with 6 completely different drawings. So there's uncertainty there. This is not something that's been proved, but we treat it like it's proof. But we talk about the 8 human connection. One of the things they do now, and one of the things that they push about how much common DNA we have, okay? Chimpanzees, the bonobo, are humans' closest living relatives, and when we look at that, I won't read that whole thing, but if you look at the bottom part, it says human and chimps share a surprising 98.8% of their DNA. Wow, we're related. We came from chimps. We came from apes. We had a common. But here's an amazing thing about it, okay? The problem, look what Jonathan Wells says, is the so-called bodybuilding genes that are in the 98%. The 2% of genes that are different are really trivial genes that have little to do with anatomy. So the supposedly similarity of human and chimpanzee DNA is a problem for the neo-Darwinists right there. So the 2% is different from me and a chimpanzee has nothing to do with the way we look. No comments, please, okay? It has to do with other things. So why? Well, Jonathan Wells says this, and I wrote what he said here because I like the way he said it. A designer might very well decide to use common building materials to create different organisms. Just as builders use the same material, steel girders, rivets, and so forth, to build different bridges, or you could say different buildings, they end up looking very dissimilar from one another. See, our God is so awesome. He's so big. He's so strong. He understands so much. He's able to put things together and say, oh, let me have a little bit of this clay. Oh, I formed this. Let me have a little bit of this. No, I formed this. Let me have a little bit of this. I formed this. But the thing about it is, he's so awesome, and all he just says, hey, make it happen. And boom, it happens. That's our God. So he can use the same materials and create different things. How many are your works? Lord. In wisdom you made them all. Your earth is full of your creatures. There is the sea, vast and spacious, teeming with creatures beyond number, living things both large and small. Yeah, share some common things, common building materials that God created out of. Science is strongly important, pointing strongly toward design. And I like what he says. To me, as a scientist, he says in his testimony, the development of an embryo cries out design. The Cambrian explosion, the sudden appearance of complex life with no evidence of ancestors, is more consistent with design than evolution. Phenomenology, in my opinion, is more compatible with design. The origin of life certainly cries out for designer. None of these things make much sense from a Darwinism perspective as they do from a design perspective. Okay? Do you see why I got so excited? Well, I don't know if you do or not, but anyway, I was excited about it. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day and night they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge. They have no speech, they have no words, no sound is heard from them, yet their voice goes out with all the earth and the words to the ends of the world. In the heavens, God has pitched a tent for the sun. God puts everything exactly where it needs to be. Now we talk about one last thing here, and then we'll end for today, the cosmos and creation. And I'm not going to go in everything else. Well, even what we did so far, we could spend weeks on the details of it. I'm just trying to give you some of the highlights. I'll give you even shorter highlights on the rest of these. But just to show you, it's a pattern. It's not just in Darwinism. It's not just in evolution. It's all through science. Okay, we talk about the Big Bang, and I remember when the Big Bang Theory started coming out and being popular, and I was actually in the Astronomical Museum up in Sherlyn, and I haven't been there for a long time, but back then you walk in, and the back wall was just kind of part of the sun, and then they had little dots, and that represented all the planets, and they're talking about the Big Bang, and I remember when it came out, and I read about it, I was like, well, that makes sense. Guy said, let it be, and it was there, okay? But it says the Big Bang was a supernatural event that cannot be explained with the realm of physics as we know it. Science has taken us to the first event, but it cannot take us further than the first cause, the sudden emergence of a matter, space, time, and energy pointing to the need for some kind of transition. Okay? Alan Sandridge said that. Again, another PhD full of lots of conditionals. If it's true there's a beginning to the universe, as modern cosmologists now agree, then this applies that a cause transcends the universe. You understand the philosophical thought there? If you have a beginning, something had to cause the beginning. Goes back to those axioms of science. Every cause, there's an effect. So something had to cause it. Okay? The Big Bang Theory and general relativity provides scientific description of what Christians call creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. Nobel Prize winner Arno Peneza said that about the Big Bang, the best data we have are exactly what I have predicted, that I have nothing to go back on the first 5 books of the Moses, the Psalms and the Bible as a whole. Okay? So, here's this physicist saying when he looks at it and he reads the Bible, he sees how they work hand in hand and works together. Okay? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. He set the sun in the heavens. It's the atheist who has to maintain by faith, despite all the evidence to the contrary, the universe did not have a beginning a finite time ago, but in some inexplicable way is eternal after all. So the shoe is on the other foot. And I love this. I was like, oh, good, finally, okay? The Christian can stand confidently with biblical truth, knowing that it's in line with mainstream astrophysics and cosmology. It's the atheist who feels very uncomfortable and marginalized today. And we're going to see some quotes next week about some astrophysicists and things that are professed atheists that say, yeah, it points to some kind of intelligent design. Okay? It's there. It makes modern science uncomfortable because God is revealed in the creation. The more we understand, the more we can see God in it. People get uncomfortable with that. They don't like to see that. They don't like to be confronted with that. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, eternal power, and divine nature have been clearly seen, understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. Efforts to come up with alternatives to standard Big Bang model have intensified in recent years. Many scientists are troubled by the fact that the beginning of the universe necessitates a creator. Others are perturbed because the law of physics can't account for the creation event. They're perturbed because they don't want to admit something else may have happened, been involved. And they've come up with different ideas and different thoughts. Did I put this in here? I don't think I put this in there. Well, next week, we're going to talk a little bit more about physics, creation, astronomy, criticism, biology, biochemistry, consciousness creation, but we're going to do it fast, okay? Not like we did Darwinism. One of the ideas is what's called multiverse. How many of you ever watched Avenger movies? Okay, you know about multiverse. Okay, if you ever watched Star Wars, you know about multiverse. That there's supposedly multiple universes happen at the same time, and different different things happen in different life. I never could figure out I love Star Trek, but I never could figure out when they talked about the multiverse going to an alternate universe, how some of the characters may die in that universe during the show, but they're live in the first universe, but somehow before that particular time period happened, all those characters happen to survive to that time. That was one of the things I never could. Well, anyway. But multiverse is basically that what it teaches is that the theory is that because our universe, we just happen to be in the right universe because there's actually billions upon trillions of universes out there. We just happen to be in the right universe that things came together at the right time for life to exist. There's absolutely no proof. There's no, in fact, in one of the other books I was reading, it's actually the proof is in the opposite direction. That there is no multiverse. There is no alternate realities. There is nothing there. And that's from a scientific background. There's no proof of that. So scientists, those who can accept, are going to push and look for alternatives. And they're going to find some that seem appealing to us. They're going to find some that seem to make sense. But we have the responsibility to look into God's Word and to view things from God's perspective. And then we will know the truth. Our hearts won't be darkened.